feels good hearing that theme tune coming in again. It's been a while. We're back on the velocity of now here on Thomas Sheridan Arts on YouTube. My website, thomassheridanarts.com, streetdruid.net, and of course, I'm always here on Thomas Sheridan Arts on YouTube, as I mentioned. I have been mad busy at the moment. It hasn't been a show for a while. I want to do them. I've got loads of new topics to talk about. I've just been so busy. I had to actually stop going on Facebook and bantering. My Facebook page is fantastic, and it's fantastic because I have fantastic people in my life. Not only do we have great discussions and banter and great crack, and we talk about all kinds of great subjects, but people find on my open source occult TV page and on my Bring Back the Snakes page, they find the most wonderful articles that I could spend hours reading and talking about. Right now, I don't have the time. I'm like a junkie with that stuff, and I have to kind of go cold turkey. So if I'll still like share this from YouTube, and then any of the YouTube videos I make onto Facebook. But I'm just give me a break until Christmas is over. I can't chat. It's not that I'm snubbing anybody. It's just that I just need to do other things. So I have like a couple of hours here this morning. I'm literally squeezing in a velocity of now right here. And that's like what it's like. I'm burning life at the end of both candles at the moment and loving every minute of it. I love working. I've got a very good, strong work ethic. I'm very happy with the work. And so I'm not complaining about anything like that. It's just that I'm not snubbing anybody. We'll get normal, if you can call it normal broadcasting, will be resumed in the new year. I hope you're all keeping well. I hope you enjoyed hearing the opening theme tune to the show again. And we're back in a familiar, comfortable place. So over the next couple of hours, get yourself a cup of tea, put on some coffee, get some beer, peanuts, whatever you want. Sit back, chill out. I'll put together a good show for you tonight because, as I said, I've been discovering quite a few new topics, and that will interest people. Things I want to talk about anyway. I'm very busy doing all kinds of stuff at the moment. So what happened since last time? Well, last time some weird shit went down. About a month ago, I went to the Hellfire Club excavations on Montpellier Hill in Dublin, which is a very spooky part of the city associated with cults, paranormal activity, ghosts, serial killers, and all kinds of weird shit. And I went there with my friend Connor. Before we went, who came down from Belfast, he told me when he was coming down, he was talking to someone up in Belfast who was in a copper up there, and he said to him, "Where are you doing tomorrow?" He said, "I'm going to Dublin. See my friend, and we're going to go up do some filming around the Hellfire Club excavations." And the guy said to him, "Don't go up there." He says, "You won't come. You'll come back a different person." So that's what literally happened to me, and it took and I've been to the Hellfire Club a few times, and I've been to Hellfire Wood, and I was always very acutely aware what a spooky and strange place that was, and the kind of reputation it has. But for some reason, I guess maybe because I'm kind of known now, and I kind of deal in the world of, should we say, the shadows, that the shadows came looking for me. Uh, we Before we got there, we met my friend Amy and her friend Marion from Dublin. And Amy does a lot. She doesn't run it, but she posts articles constantly to bring back the snakes. So you probably know her from there. And we went for a nice little walk into Massey's Forest, Massey's Wood, where I used to camp a lot as a teenager. And I was just remembering the place and the amazing old bridge, just beautiful autumnal foliage on these old growth trees. And she showed us where the lady, sorry, showed us where the Bronze Age, I think it's older actually, uh, court cairn is on the side of a hill. It's built into a wall. It's amazing it survived that all, but it was there. And I was in good form when I was running around. We were having a laugh and having the chat. And they had to go back to where they were from to do something with their families. And myself and Connor continued up the hill. And we were just having a chat. And as I got to the top of the hill, I started, and it wasn't tiredness. I mean, I wasn't that tired when I got there. It was a sense of something pushing down on my shoulders and a sense of something screwing my head. It was not. It was like depression, and I don't have depression. I don't suffer from depression or anything like that. But it felt like depression. It felt like that, like almost like a sense of dread, absolute dread. we got to the top, and they were making it was very windy. The views of the city of Dublin is sensational from the top of the hill. It's worth just going up for that alone. And the what you call it were up there. The archaeologists were digging on the two cairns that are up there, which the archaeologists did not look happy. They looked worn out and and just fatigued. You could see they wanted this dig to be over. And speaking to one of the young archaeologist girls, they found some Neolithic artwork up there, very exciting. They found a mace head, an axe head, and those two large two large enclosures on top of the Neolithic enclosures, temples, tombs. I don't call them tombs, on top of the hill, which is really a mountain. It's well over 1,000 feet tall. They call it Montpellier Hill. It's actually a mountain, technically speaking. And they're both determined to be the size of Newgrange, so they were quite large in their day when they were built, and they would have been seen from miles away, probably as far away as probably Bruno Bettelheim, Newgrange, which you could see the hill of Tara from the top of Montpellier that day on the other way on the other side of the city and across North County Dublin to Meath. And they were digging away there, and they looked knackered and fatigued and everything. We're chatting away with them, and and normally when I get to these kinds of places, I'm all over everybody, talking to them. I want to get information. I have my lovely new camera up there. I just didn't feel like doing fucking anything. It was horrible. And so one of the tombs, one of the court enclosures, one of the Neolithic structures was actually raided for the stones to build the Hellfire Club. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the Hellfire Club because I'm also in the process of making some films. 2017, I'm going to be producing some documentaries. One will be on occult cities, and the first one will be Dublin. So I'll be dealing with that in that film. So not too much into the notorious history of the Hellfire Club and Hellfire Wood, and also another documentary I'm working on demonology and what are demons exactly. And they're coming out on my open source occult TV YouTube channel. So subscribe to that if you haven't been on it yet. I'll put the link below. But anyway, I was up there, and there was also another film crew up there making a film for some. I was talking to the young girl, the runner there, and it was for some English newspaper. I thought it was a Telegraph or the Sunday Times. It was some kind of film they were making. So there's a film crew in the place running a generator. I went into it, and I was trying to have to do the Derek Acora joking thing, putting on the voice, going, Mary loves Dick, Mary loves Dick, that famous Derek Acora thing. And it just didn't feel right. And on top of one of the Neolithic enclosures, they built more or less the Hellfire Club. And that was the one they excavated, and they found the rock art, and they found that. Remember, I was telling you that some Neolithic structures in Ireland are evil and some are not. Well, I don't know about this one, but they'd literally opened the gates of hell and the abyss, and things came out, and you could tell by the look of the young archaeologist's face that it worn heavy on them. Well, this thing saw me and said, "This guy Sheridan's coming up the mountain," and I was literally attacked. And I don't say that in a joking or in a shall we say, a coy or a laid back way. I was absolutely psychically and energetically savage to the point where I had no energy left by the time I got home that night. I went to bed and literally slept for 2 days straight. And I wasn't right for another couple of weeks afterwards. There was this awful sensation was left in me. Some kind of entity or demon, which those mountains and that woods are famous for. Then we're going to talk about that tonight in basically the theme of this show. And it got me. And I'm okay over it now. But this is like, when people warn you about the dangers of the occult, even though if you're sensible, it's no problem. But also, you invite attacks. You become a shiny, sparkly thing that they notice, especially of a Neolithic court cairn on top of a mountain next to Dublin, with the Hellfire Club beside Hellfire Wood, in an area that's spooky and strange anyways, being ripped open to be excavated and letting whatever's in there out. And also on the other Neolithic structure beside it, they built the Masonic column. They call it the navigation marker, but it's actually a Masonic column planted right on top of it. You couldn't make this stuff up. So there I was in the belly of the esoteric beast, hardcore occult Dublin, hardcore Neolithic entities, the fairies, the magic. There was everywhere. It was they got me that day, and I was where I shouldn't have been, and it's my own fault and myself to blame, and that's just it. And that's what happened. That was been interesting since the last thing. That's my cat Philo screaming in the background. That's not anything weird. But yeah, so that was that experience, and it's it may sound like a very strange or a very odd kind of thing to deal with in the 21st century of technology, but we haven't really changed. In fact, in some ways, I think the world is kind of going back to almost a pre-Socratic view. Like well, I personally am starting to feel that way. Like, I mean, things like magic has become central to my life. So is art, and lots of people listening to the show have developed interest in these kinds of things as well. People have lost interest in politics and started to explore the old stones and stuff. You think I was just thinking back to, like, look at the Egyptians, despite them being governed by a priest class, and say the Babylonians, they still produced spectacular advancements in engineering, maths, and astronomy. And that flies very much in the face of contemporary ideas that societies run by priestly classes or castes play based on orthodox thinking produce nothing. And it is true that these societies do monopolize and limit thought to a certain degree. The population are infused with a kind of a sense of magical destiny because of this. This is why the monuments of the ancient world prove this approach can, like, unleash from spectacular material achievement. And so successful was the idea that even secular atheistic societies such as the Soviet Union called upon similar ideas of magical destiny during their own, 5-year plans and so on. And Stalin had become a kind of an Akhenaten god. They still knew there was a power in a magically driven society where there was a sense of magic destiny. This is why globalization has failed, because the technocrats and the plutocrats behind it failed to incorporate a sense of magical destiny. They stuck up all these scientists talking about how you have no soul, you're dead, you're only DNA. It did not inspire anyone except meat golems. And after, like, then you had, like, so after sort of like that's Babylonian Egyptian ancient society, you had the rise of philosophy in ancient Greece. It started around 470 BC or so, and it was basically a move towards a kind of logical understanding of how existence arose. And the first group, the Milesians, were the first kind of group to pose the big question concerning the nature of reality and the meaning of human existence. There was a guy called Anaximander who proposed that the idea of a fundamental stuff was where everything arose and returned to was atomism. So they were very clever early on. They was understand, these early philosophers had moved beyond the priest class of Babylon and ancient Egypt, and in Greece had actually started to understand that the universe is composed of tiny matter. You're moving towards a quantum atomic view. And you look at then you had, like, the liar Pythagoras came along, and this is why mathematics was considered a type of magic, and still is. I mean, mathematics is a kind of a magical thing. This was even as late as the Enlightenment, when mathematicians were frowned upon as being sorcerers. And there is a dark sorcery in it, because remember, Pythagoras, the father of mathematics, actually he drowned one of his students, who pointed out that even on this planet alone, there were anomalies that mathematical perfection flew in the face of. It wasn't perfectly uniform. And that was like almost like that symbolic murder by Pythagoras of one of his students by drowning him was the beginning of the psychopathic control grids idea. Like, you do what we say or we kill you, or we call you conspiracy theorists, or we lock you out, or we call you kooks. So in some ways, the only reason we have a reasoned logical society where people like me can go to the Hellfire Club and be badly affected and come back and be called kooks is because it's only these arbitrary rules of control are held in force by strict social and even governance by politicians and schools and education and even society itself. Although I always say that the greatest policeman is the one they put inside your head, blowing a whistle every time you have a free, independent thought. And after that, after that philosophy developed, centuries later, up to the present, and they have philosophers and are still trying to figure out and come to terms with the answer to the meaning of life. And these exercises have no doubt made our human existence far more interesting They have not made it any more meaningful. You see, that's the point. Like, even though I'm a big fan of philosophy, has philosophy ultimately made our lives more meaningful? I don't know about that one. In many ways, philosophy has kind of reached the same state of static paralysis, which, initially arose in the ancient theocratic societies which they were trying to replace. And what have they got? And what have they got to show for it? Well, they don't have the spectacular monuments of the ancient world. There's no Hanging Gardens of Babylon. There's no Stonehenge. There's no Newgrange. There's no Giza. There's no Aztec pyramids. There's no nothing. There's nothing. It hasn't left any kind of spectacular legacy in terms of material construction. And if anything, much of it has created a few genocides along the way. And just, personally speaking, ideas such a philosophy, while creating a more interesting view of life, are still rooted in the passive relationship of man with the natural world. We are subjected to its forces. And on the other hand, magic provides us the means to alter reality. You see, it's different. A magical sense of spiritual awareness increases the psychic faculties that are surprisingly powerful when we start to unleash them. So it's hardly surprising that the decline of the Greek Empire began when the gods and goddesses were taken from the everyday world, Mount Olympus and so on, and placed in the heavens as planets and constellations. The gods and goddesses were removed from the pagan understanding of being here amongst us and transported into the heavens. What people like me, I guess, what we're doing is we're bringing the gods down back from the sky. We're bringing the gods back down to earth, and the gods and goddesses, and maybe even trying to make ourselves our own kind of god and goddess. And this is why I can have these experiences on Montpellier Hill and not end up in it, feeling like I've had some horrible mental breakdown. It wasn't. I knew exactly what it was. It was forces from the other world who had basically ambushed me, and that was that, and that's the end of it. And I'm perfectly okay with people calling them whatever they want to call them, fairies, jinns, or even the demons of the mind. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It still has that same feeling. That's a feeling it left in me. What do they say? Nothing is done without the devil's blessing. I totally think there's a lot of truth to that. The flaws we possess are often the ignition of our own potential for greatness. That's how I feel about it. When I see things like when you see things like Brexit and Trump happening, they're potentials for greatness in us. Yeah, as yin cannot be resolved without yang. Uh, every saint must accept the sinner in them with tolerance. Everything that's worthwhile doing is done with the devil's blessing. That's why I always say the greatest gift that life can give you is being betrayed by your own beliefs or mentor, because it allows you to think for yourself. It becomes like sort of like a harvest of sort of internal psychic thunderbolts that have been released. While I was up there in Montpellier Hill, I also had they're looking into the woods. I started to those woods up there are quite old, and I was thinking this whole idea, especially this time of year when you have Grampus in Austria and northern Italy, this idea of the wild man, and you have this. I find it interesting that you have the proliferation of these sort of wild men festivals happen mainly in former communist countries: Bohemia, Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Slovenia, and so on, Poland, the Slavic nations. Why is that? Well, it's almost like because they had communism, and the communists were so busy oppressing Christianity, particularly Catholicism, that they forgot to look at the folk traditions, which actually they thought were just like twee and harmless. So it was almost like some kind of pagan magic created communism in order to suppress Christianity, so the old ways could come back. I just find it interesting that all this stuff happens in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, and these kind of ancient wild man customs of wearing the horns and so on is associated with the winter solstice. In the Romanian tradition, the goat man dies. That's a very important one in Romanian rural areas, and is resurrected. And it's resurrected. Of course, I spoke about Krampus, and he's unleashed on December 6th in parts of Austria and parts of northern Italy. His arrival is marked by a bell ringing procession. Bell. You see, the bell is a very important esoteric symbol. It also looks like a beehive as well. So this is I know I go on these huge tangents, but we'll get to all this one day eventually, either on the shows or in books. This is how my brain works. My brain is like a gigantic encyclopedia, a library, and rather than having an index cards that we can go and look at certain books, a book falls off the shelf and then I find another book. And that's how it works for me. Sometimes it seems confusing, but there is a resolution at the end. My mind is like, what's that movie, Chinatown? You can't follow the plot until the end. Okay, so we have Krampus on December 6th marching through the villages. He's followed by the characters such as Det and the Goatman. The Goatman shows up again. This is where the devil came from. In the Greece, in contemporary modern Greece, the festivals connected with animal skins. They also ring bells, and a similar tradition takes place in Bohemia, which is in the Czech Republic now, or Czechia, whatever they call the country now. In all cases, the connection with Saint Nicholas runs deep. These pageants represent the shadow aspect of Saint Nicholas, Old Nick, Old Nick the devil, ultimately derived in archetypal sense from the Odin, Woden, and the pagan festivals of Yuletide. So that's where we are right now. I kind of generally celebrate on a low-key personal level between the last full moon and the next new moon. So it's so we get my calendar. I have the list of the moons and in the pages. But that are the Wild Man Festival, the survival of the primal forces. The devil always, nothing good happens without the devil's blessing. This is why people invoke demons. This is why people, they summon up entities for favors. Again, it's the devil's work, the craft. I summoned up an entity on Montpellier Hill accidentally that day. It messed me up for about 2 days very badly, and then probably 2 weeks less afterwards. I'm fine now. But what did that teach me? Well, it didn't have me running down to a church mauling a set of rosary beads. It didn't have me running to a psychiatrist or psychologist. It had me sitting down thinking and saying, what happened here? I processed that, and now I feel good about it because now I have a new experience. I was given something with the devil's blessing. Now, tonight's show, continuing on that vein, I know you like this stuff, and I love this stuff too. So I come across an article written by a lady called Emer Dennehy here in Ireland, which is called What Damned You? Changelings, Millengar, and Other Dead Child Traditions. Now, she discusses aspects of folklore and superstition relating to children, how these old wives' tales may have influenced their treatment and burial and their subsequent acceptance into the afterlife. Again, a synchronicity. While I was researching for the occult film on Dublin, I found out that there is a Changeling graveyard in the opening of St. Stephen's Green in Dublin, where the Boer War Memorial Arch is. And St. Stephen's Green today is a beautiful park, but it has a very spooky, dark history, which we'll cover in the film. And so this article shows up in my life, and again, I'll be reading for it and paraphrasing from the article. I know you like this, and I like doing this too. So Miss Dennehy has written this very, very good article on the sort of spookiness around the dead child. Now, this is something that'll never go away, ever. Like I was talking about, like I did a video there about the occult or paranormal aspects of abortion. I'm pro-abortion. I don't have any problem with abortion. One needs to let it get it. I'm just saying that there is an undiscovered or unrelated, unexplored idea of the kind of the paranormal or the cult aspects of abortion. Like you hear a story of even some Wiccan groups who deliberately have abortions, these women, as human sacrifice rituals. That's why dark feminism and Wiccanism is often kind of linked, especially from the 60s feminist movement on. Just saying, I'm not putting down any saying it's all Wiccans. I'm just saying it's happened. There are some tantalizing documents there. Now, they are, the idea when a woman has a baby, I'm not putting down working moms or anything like this, but the idea of, like, I think one guy, some guy, men's rights guys, called it a career abortion when a woman has a baby and then has it raised by nannies while she goes off on her career. Well, that's creating a kind of a shadow. Now, in the old days, there's nothing wrong with that. I've nothing against women who do that. But I find that when that works best, generally, when the woman goes back to work, her sister or her mother or a relative in the family helps with taking care of the child. So the child grows up perfectly healthy and normal. It's when they stick them with nannies and put them in like Montessori's and things like this that the problems develop. So, but because there's a shadow will develop there. So again, I'm not putting down abortion. I'm pro-abortion. I'm not putting down women who work and have kids. I'm pro that. I'm just saying, nothing happens with the devil's blessing. We all have a price to pay. So, and this idea, this struggle, you see, we live in an age where we think that human life is always sacred. Well, people killed their babies until about 100 years ago. That was quite normal. If the baby was born deformed, if the baby could, the baby wasn't something right with the baby, they killed the baby. Now, they would be horrified, but that's okay for you, where you can drive to the supermarket or get all the groceries delivered. In the olden days, a child who was disabled or had a congenital defect or a genetic defect, this child could not potentially kill the family. Not the child's fault, so they used to kill the babies, often drown them or leave them out into the snow and that kind of thing. Still goes on in Inuit tribes. So don't get all this thing like, oh God, what the little children. It's easy for you in your 21st century comfort to sit there and be judgmental. So hopefully this article will give you lot a bit of an education here, that infanticide was your ancestors, until you'd be very surprised how recent in your family history committed infanticide. So don't be acting like all self-righteous about it. I just took a cup of tea then, so before I start reading. Okay, What Damned You by Emer Dennehy. Europe's widespread conversion to Christianity in the early medieval period was a difficult and protracted process. During this time, many ingrained pre-Christian practices would, despite an outward show of rejection, continue to be respected privately. In certain circumstances, pagan practices were ultimately incorporated into the everyday culture of Christian life. In general, the conversion to Christianity is analysed with a view to its impact on adult life, but it also has a deep impact on the status and treatment of children. This article will address how the practices and superstitions of the old religions influence the new Christian attitude towards the treatment and burial of children, in particular the unbaptized, and how this might be reflected within the archaeological record, as baptism facilitated the passage of a child or adult from a state of original sin to a state of grace. The absence of baptism equally excluded the child from the community of the living and of the dead. So if the child wasn't baptized, they couldn't take their place within the community of the dead in the Christian tradition. But that goes back into pre-Christians, as we find out. Returning to the article. With this in mind, it is important to note that Ireland, while an island, was not insular or unique in its attitudes towards differential treatment of either unbaptized children or individuals otherwise excluded from social norms. Themes and practices recorded in Ireland were also commonly identified worldwide in folklore and in legal and religious documentation. For Europe at least, this may be largely attributed to the transfer and mingling of Christian and pre-Christian cultural ideologies. Iceland, which converted to Christianity in AD 1000, preserves some of the most comprehensive evidence related to the impact of Christianity on pre-existing beliefs and practices. Iceland is fortunate in that the laws regarding the physical and spiritual treatment of suicides and other deviants were recorded in contemporary documentation, providing insight into social and legal status of those individuals. These laws also chronicled society's attitude to child baptism and the treatment of unbaptized children, both upon their death and their subsequent movement into the afterlife. It is also the country for which the earliest documented evidence for the separate burial of unbaptized children exists. Iceland's conversion was subject to three agreed exemptions, namely that the exposure of children, i.e. infanticide, that was a child you didn't want or you couldn't take care of or was deformed, placed out in the ice and snow and left to be killed by the elements. There were Christians allowed the Icelandics to do this. The eating of horse flesh that was forbidden by Catholics, but the eating of horse flesh was that was a prohibition by the, I don't know why, by the Catholics, but they were allowed to do that. And the private worship, that probably because resources were limited in terms of agriculture in Iceland, and the private worship of all gods would all be permitted. That's why the fairy and the elf faith and so on has survived so well in Iceland. They got a very good agreement with Christianity, probably similar to what the early Irish monks did and what I talk about in the Druid Code with St. Kieran and so on. That's why just about so many early Irish saints are ex-Druids and so on, or ex-gods, Gaelic gods or goddesses. The exposure of newborn children was both permitted and guided by the traditional oral law. Exposure was seen as a means of disposing of surplus or illegitimate children, as a means of gender selection, and as a means of addressing monstrous quote unquote births, that is, infants born with visible physical deformities. From a clerical standpoint, monstrous births and infant mortality were portrayed as a reflection of a sinful misdeeds of the parents. Now, this came from the Christians, not from the heathens. The only means of prevention of or solution to was baptism. On conversion to Christianity, Icelanders accepted the concept that the baptism of newborn infants was essential. Nevertheless, exposure could still be the inevitable outcome, even if the child was baptized. And there's a quote here: each child born shall be reared in our land, unless it is born with these deformities, the face turned back where the nape of the neck should be, or the toes and where the heels should be, then shall that child be taken to the church, raised up out of heathendom, and laid down in the church and left to die. Now that's an interesting one, but just off topic here for a second. The toes being the wrong way round. There's something about toes and the fairy world. In the Irish tradition, when people were believed to have been captured by the fairies as babies and taken away, and then came back into this reality, they often came back with no toes, whatever that means. And here's in the Icelandic record, they're talking about monstrous births, children born with their toes in the wrong place. Returning to the text, irrespective of the documented presence or absence of contemporary laws, all societies had cultural rules governing real fears regarding children, be they related to a living child believed to be possessed by a supernatural being, example, a changeling, or to a non-Baptist child reverent, i.e., a deceased child returning to the spirit, denied eternal rest within consecrated ground. In instances of changeling or monstrous spirits, cultural rules related to a child's physical and spiritual state would be implemented collectively by the community of peers. In this way, the good social status of the mother would be retained despite her child's outward deformity. In direct contrast, these cultural rules preserved within the guise of folk tales and superstitions, the quintessential old wives' tale, often sectioned and justified extreme physical actions towards the afflicted child. Now, this is where it gets quite dark. Changelings and supernatural beings. Changelings, supernatural beings that were substituted for human offspring, are an ancient concept which has been documented in various forms, not just Norse, Germanic, and Slavic cultures, but also in Judaism, in Asian and African cultures. Very common. In Irish folk tales, they are referred to as the Sofar. When in European tales, they occur under a variety of names: Changeling, France; Marii, Romania; Velschla-Blag, Germany; Utbard and Myling, Sweden; Unstrap-Ungia, Iceland; and Zimaktaka, Russia. Fairies, demons, and trolls would exchange their offspring for human children for a number of reasons. In the supernatural offspring, if the supernatural offspring was sickly, it might be exchanged for a healthy human child. Elderly fairies could be substituted into a cradle to place the burden of care on the human family, while other tales allege that fairies believed that being raised by humans would bring respectability to their offspring. In Scandinavia, it was believed that ugly trolls would seek pretty human babies to rear them as their own, while in Russia, wood demons would steal children and imprison them in the forest. This is a common one, not just in Russia, but all over Northern Europe. The idea that in the souls of imprisoned children live within the woods. Many of the that's well, I'm going to talk about that in the upcoming documentary on occult Dublin. Many of the physical traits assigned to changelings would today have a clear medical explanation: a developmental malformation such as a cleft palate or a club foot, a genetic anomaly such as Down syndrome, or in extreme cases a fatal abnormality such as Edwards syndrome. Changelings were often described as having insatiable appetites while paradoxically failing to gain weight, along with persistent crying and vomiting, which perhaps reflected hungry baby syndrome, colic, or gastric reflux disease. again, anyone who's reading this saying, "Oh, it's so evil," what they did to these deformed children. But this is a matter of life and death. You could not bring a deformed child into the world in these kinds of substance based agrarian societies. It just wasn't possible. The rest of the family would starve, and there was no one to actually help when they grew up. So it's you're being judgmental here, but you don't have to live on the edge of existence like these people did in the past. Developmental conditions that have no outward symbol in newborn infants but manifest themselves in older children, such as those classed as autism spectrum disorder, could also have led to a belief that the child was possessed, particularly when they failed to develop in a similar way to their peers. This is substantiated through numerous European religious and court documents relating to the exposure of older changelings. For example, in 1535, Martin Luther spoke of a 12-year-old boy in a case where the devil had put himself into the cradle in place of the stolen child. In 1690, a 10-year-old changeling was exposed in Gotland, Sweden, and in Ireland in 1826, a 4-year-old boy believed to be fairy struck was drowned in the River Flesk in County Kerry, while in 1884 a 3-year-old fairy child was severely scalded with a hot shovel in Clonmel, County Tipperary, the latter act carried out by 2 female neighbours when the child had been left unattended by the mother. Dark stuff. To prevent an unbaptized child from being possessed or switched, its name should not be spoken out loud. Traditionally, the child's name was of great importance, as it was through receipt of this baptismal name that the social responsibility of the child was rewarded. Quote, I was made a Christian when my name was given. Once a fairy knew the child's name, the child was at risk of being exchanged. In England and Germany, in order to protect unborn and unbaptized children and to minimize the chance of a supernatural interference, terms such as pot lid or jack in the cellar were used when referring to them. In numerous cultures, including Ireland, Portugal, and Romania, it was further believed that the unbaptized child should never be left unattended. A fire should always be kept burning in the room, and the bathwater from a newborn child should never be thrown out. This is interesting. Fires and incense burning. Now they're saying they were burned fires, but I would imagine that herbs like rosemary and turf smoke and other kinds of aromatic herbs like cedar would have been used in these fires where the unbaptized baby was. It's been known that these aromatic incense is what chases off demons. The demon documentary will talk about a famous incident that happened in Italy in the Colosseum. But let's just say there's a reason why when they have a Corpus Christi parade in the Catholic tradition, why they have 2 altar boys at the front waving incense. The 2 altar boys the demons are attracted to all the bling and everything on the bishop, but they go for the altar boys because they're innocent, but the altar boys wave the incense in order to keep it off them. The Catholic judges never tell you this, but they'll admit it quietly off scene. Catholic masses are absolute huge targets for demons. So there's incense everywhere. And so the same thing, burning incense in the house, rosemary, sage in the American tradition, Native American tradition. You'd have turf smoke in Ireland, cedar, this kind of thing, incense in the Hindus tradition. They ward off demons. Demons are attracted to dark, musty, smelly, dark, damp places. That's been known since Babylonian times. Back to the text. Changelings were also generally male, and some cultures, including Ireland, promoted the dressing of male infants in female clothes. This is why Lady Wilde dressed Oscar Wilde as a little girl, in order to confuse the otherworldly beings. And that's probably where also the term fairy for homosexual comes from. Many cultures also believe that protection could be afforded through the placement of items in the child's cradle or swaddling. Metal was an optimum choice, as fairies could not touch it. In Ireland, an iron nail or knife was used. Well, iron is a tricky one because it can repel and also attract demons. You have to be careful with that one. Also, if you're involved, you saw that video of those people that contacted me in County Roscommon that they'd made that pyramid. I think when they held the iron bar, what they did was they basically channeled their own psychic protection force into this pyramid, and then they were open for demonic attack. In Sweden and Scotland, silver was preferred. In the absence of metal, Everyday items such as spices, very good. Salt, well, spice, rosemary again. Spices, salt in Scandinavia, very important salt. And a silk cart in Belgium could be used. While in Romania and Macedonia, a broom would be left beside the cradle to sweep away evil. This is why witches have the brooms. Evidence for some of these practices may survive in the archaeological burial record. Once it was confirmed that a child was a changeling, or exchange could be enforced by tricking the fairy mother into exposing the child's true character. This was achieved either by exposure of the changeling overnight in the woods, on a beach below the high water mark, or on the roof or altar, bringing the changeling to a crossroads, very common in Ireland, where fairies and witches would meet and confront. We'll do a show. We'll do a VON at some point in the future on the symbolism and the esoteric aspect of the crossroads. At at Three Rivers is documented about Ireland and in France, scalding with a hot shovel. That's not very nice, but burning and beating could also force an exchange. The acts of cruelty would either frighten the fairy out of its body or entice its parents to return to the human child, crying, I treated your child so nicely, and look what you do to mine. This was in direct parallel to the baptismal rite where the child cries, as it was blessed by the holy water, was the cry of evil, or immanudes, being forced out of the stall. This is what the Catholics believe, that when they pour the freezing cold, and the Orthodox especially, they pour the freezing cold water on the baby. The screams of the baby is the demon leaving. I have a different feeling about that. I actually think the baby is being waterboarded, and the waterboarding is actually puts the baby into shock. If we weren't baptized at all, you see, this is the double-edged sword here. You notice how the changeling problem only really happened when Christians came along baptizing babies. Think about that one. If babies weren't baptized, they wouldn't have the changeling problem. Back to the text. Cruelty though popular, was not only available method. As recorded in Ireland, Iceland, and Germany, an elderly changing could be exposed by inducing it to laugh. This is very good stuff. This is the satire magic I talk about. Remember what I said about cult members who are all demonically infected from the cult leader channeling herself or himself in the future as a god. And also these types, they don't get psychopaths, they don't get humor. They don't get satire. They don't understand satire. And someone like me is an aberration to them because I'm always telling jokes using satire because they're demonically infected and because they're not fully human in a cognitive sense. They don't get satire. They take it literally. And this was a way of getting demons out of people at one time, was performing acts of absurdity. Humans have always used satirical magic. Always. Mothers were frequently advised by older women to pretend to cook food, brew beer, or boil water in eggshells, so that the changeling would involuntarily laugh and proclaim, though old as I be as the forest, cooking in an eggshell never did I see, and things like that. Pretend to be cooking with invisible utensils and stuff like that. The idea was to chase the changeling out, the fairy or the demon out, by exposing them with these absurdities. This is why humans embark upon us. This is where the idea of absurdities came from. If a child survived the home exorcism, it was welcomed back into the community. If the process resulted in death of the changeling child, the human child was lost eternally to the supernatural world. And this is where this is real interesting. This is where this could tie in with ideas of abortion. Now, again, I'm not judging anyone who has an abortion. I'm not talking about that. The idea that the baby becomes a kind of astral corpse, and that astral corpse becomes a pathological entity within the spirit world. Back to the text. Dead child traditions. The theme of hauntings by child reverends, who were secretly buried in unconsecrated ground, either owing to their absence of baptism or to hide their murder, is prevalent in European dead child traditions. Death was perceived of as a journey. Those who died an unnatural death did not immediately enter the afterlife, but instead were doomed to walk for a period of time between worlds. This is the astral corpses. These are the entities you see that you think are ghosts, or the ones when you're contacting through Ouija boards and stuff like that. David Conway, in his books on magic, writes some great stuff on astral corpses. Check that out. And so they're walking between the worlds, requiring assistance from a stranger or family member to complete the journey. So this whole thing of the psychics thing, go towards the light and all this kind of thing. Name pair legends where a child reverend is found crying in a graveyard or other liminal space and can be appeased either through lay baptism or by naming were documented from the 1400s, such as the manuscript of Boylan Abbey in York in England. These revenants were often seen as older children or as flickering lights rather than infants. This is the weird kind. This is why the black-eyed children might be a modern version of this. As the sex of the and relating to abortion or maybe child neglect. I mean, we could talk about the idea of thresholds and Hecate, but that's another subject. I don't want this show to go on for 9 hours. Uh, as the sex of the child was not known, lay baptism was achieved by calling out, "If you are a boy, I name you John. If you're a girl, I name you Jane." Name pair legends were the dominant dead child tradition in Ireland. Children were seen as quiet souls to be cherished and pitied. Those who harmed them were damned. In particular, the soul of the mother who killed the infant would not find rest until she confessed her sin and received absolution. This is probably why Ireland is probably the last country in Western Europe that bans abortion. This is a very ancient legacy left over in our culture. This is the theme of the petticoat loose dead child tradition. A woman's tormented spirit is confronted by the parish priest demanding to know what damned you. Her ultimate response would be, "I killed an unbaptized child." The Irish attitude to child revenants is a stark contrast to the tales of the Mylingar, which dominates the Scandinavian dead child tradition. The term myling, derived from myrach, murdered, was the first documented in 1647. See, the myling was an aggressive ghost that lurked in dark forests, seeking consecrated burial or vengeance on its murdered mother. It would force lone wanderers to carry it to a cemetery, becoming heavier and heavier. What was I saying at the beginning about the Hellfire Club? We're going to go there in a minute. Closer they got. Should the wanderer collapse under the weight of the burden before reaching the cemetery, the myling would devour him. Should the myling find his natural mother, it would murder her, often by ripping open her breast with its deadly claws. Child burial practices. If the child were to die before baptism, be it a victim of infanticide, perceived as a changeling, or some other reason, it could not be buried within consecrated ground. An other location was chosen. This could be in the form of formalized burial within a keelan, which is recorded in monuments of Ireland, 1,400 of them still remain, or deceased infants could be disposed of in privies, that's dunghills and various other public places, that's septic tanks and sewage. Okay, going from the text, what was the big scandal in Ireland a few years ago? 800 babies dumped in a septic tank in Tuam, County Galway, by nuns. Many of those children would have been the children of the nuns who had sex with groundskeepers and tradesmen who visited, and that's why they were dumped in the septic tank. This is why, until I'm blue in the face, I will say that Christianity was the greatest catastrophe that ever inflicted itself upon the pagan or heathen world. Notice how all these horrors come into these children are from the post-Christian baptismal era. There was no records of mylings and these kinds of killings in Scandinavia prior to 1600s, long after Christianity had developed and established itself. So that right off then disposed in privies, dunghills, and various public places. They were dumped. They were dumped in septic tanks, and the nuns at Tuam were evoking a very ancient archetype. A very ancient archetype. Many of those children that were put into that septic tank were actually from pregnant nuns. Never admit, of course. They still have urges and sexual urges. This was such a recognised problem that from the 17th century, British midwives swore an oath to bury children in such a secret place as neither hog, dog, nor any other beast may come onto it, and that the infant would not be cast into the lanes or any other inconvenient places. Accounts from the 18th century Dublin record the regular drowning of infants in the River Liffey and the abandonment of infants in shop fronts and even within the perimeter of the ditch of St. Stephen's Green. Now, St. Stephen's Green, that's going to be, you're going to get a whole insight of that on the Occult Dublin documentary. Child abandonment and infanticide continued well into the 20th century. A notable case was recorded in 1940 in Ballina, County Mayo, not very far from where I live here, when the mummified remains of two newborn babies were found under the bed of a widowed publican. It was the fear of revenants returning to seek vengeance or to inflict other punishments that led to this phobic or otherwise abnormal burial practices. The most noted of these was the burial of unbaptized children at the crossroads with a stake through their heart to prevent them from walking. This is why many rural crossroads in Ireland, there's a statue of the Virgin Mary at the crossroads usually, or some religious shrine. There would have been babies buried there with stakes pushed through their heart. This is where the vampire thing came from. Remember, Bram Stoker's mother was from rural County Sligo, and she raised him on all these stories when he was a child. And the stake through the heart of the baby that stopped the baby's ghost from walking up obviously made its way into his Dracula tale. Returning to the text, so prevalent was this practice that in AD 1000 Bishop Bouchard of Worms, Germany, an author of canon law, evoked a penance for 2 years to prevent it. The practice is known to have continued, however, in both Britain with reference to suicides and Russia with reference to witches until the mid-19th and early 20th century, respectively. In Ireland, the practice of the prone, face-down burial of infants was recorded in the Alachar Labachar by Sean O'Sullivan, which was carried out if the infant was illegitimate to prevent the father from having more children, or if the infant's birth had placed the mother's life at risk. The burial of unbaptized children in liminal places is well documented and substantiated in various customs, such as that from West Galway, which state that if a child dies before it is baptized by the priest, he must be buried in the boundary between the two townlands. Nevertheless, acts of kindness were also baptized in the burial rites of children. For example, the Inuit of Greenland would have buried an infant with a live dog so that the animal could act as a guide to the child in the afterlife. That's very similar to the Egyptian ideas of burial. In Ireland, a cup was frequently placed in a child's grave so that the child could drink milk in the afterlife. Some traditions held that, and this today we do things like that. People put mobile phones and iPhones in coffins to call people in the grave, or they want bizarre. Some traditions held that no end stone should be placed in the grave to allow the child to continue to grow. While within the Kiln in Reesk in County Kerry, a child was buried with a stone doll. Conclusion: the analysis of folk tales and superstitions provides archaeologists with a valuable insight into various social and religious pressures that parents faced either as individuals or a community of peers to protect their children and secure its acceptance into society. The above analysis confirmed that it was not just unbaptized or stillborn infants that could be denied consecration, burial. Older baptized children may also have been refused consecrated burial if they possess physical or mental deformities. Rejection by society influenced both the burial and the afterlife of the child. The persistence of these traditions and attitudes toward individuals who were unnamed or unbaptized exemplified in the story recounted to an archaeologist, Noel Dunn, of a baby girl abandoned in a cart in Kilteal, County Kildare, in the latter half of the 19th century. Discovered by the cart's owner, the man by the name of Broderick, on his return back to Monasterevin, the baby was brought back and reared with the Broderick family, but was never assigned the Broderick surname, becoming known as Mags Kilteal. On her death, she was denied a consecrated burial and was interred in Lugail Killeen, a short distance south of Monasterevin, distanced by the living who loved her, and by the dead who feared her, as no one knew who or what she really was. Fantastic article there by Emer Dennehy, and I hope you enjoyed that. Now, talking about the miling as a ghost or of an unconsecrated or a murdered child, that was very commonly practiced in the area around in the woods and the mountains. Excuse me, around Dublin in the mountains. Dublin is weird. It has like this really next to the city. They have this really remote place called the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains. They just go on for miles and miles and miles of wilderness, forest, moorland, bogland. It's all there, and each valley has a different microclimate. A different one might be beautiful and covered in woodlands, so they don't have to be like a bleak, dark, cold place. And dead children were often taken up into the mountains and left there, especially in the woods, and there was wild animals would eat them and stuff. And I think that the myling, if any of oh, it is true, the rumors and the stories regarding the Hellfire Club, it would have been involved. If we know anything about the elites today, they like sex with children, they like killing children, and this was definitely an occult, dark society. We do know that it is true, although it's often sensationalized, but and there's a grim thing to think about. But there are freaks out there, as we saw with the Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington D.C., who have a bizarre, unnatural attraction to children. So we'll leave it at that. I'll be doing more shows before Christmas. There might be one tomorrow or even later, one second one tonight. Whenever I have an open slot, I'm going to do a Velocity of Now. I'm not going to abandon you. We're going to have an interesting and informative Christmas. So until the next show, the date today was the 5th of December 2016. If you want to support me, go buy a book, The Druid Code. If you liked what you heard on the show tonight, you'll love all the stuff in that. It's got some great reviews going up on Amazon now. And took after yourself and feck 'em if they can't take a joke.